from a company, and PRC is sponsoring Bruce, along with Semantic Compaction, to come down here and speak to us today. I think everybody's going to leave here so happy that they came. Bruce is just dynamic, and we're so excited for him to be here. Bruce is an adjunct professor at the University of Pittsburgh.
Yes.
The CEO of Semantic Compaction. He's been my mentor since a long time at Temple University. Bruce and I have worked together for many years, and I think everybody here is going to absolutely enjoy and fall in love with him, as half of you already are. All right, so without further ado, Mr. Baker.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to talk to a Phoenix audience because it tends to be much more sophisticated than the average audience I talk to. And it also tends to be slightly more nerve-wracking, you know, to talk to. And I'm very pleased to be here today. The last time I was in Phoenix was my mother's last trip. She was 91 years old, and we were here, and we had dinner with Caroline and her husband, and Judy Myers and her husband, and that's all I can remember. But mother was getting rather fragile at that time, and she lived to be 93, but a few weeks after Phoenix, she began declining fairly rapidly. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. And of course, it's just freezing out there. I mean, you know, if I'm longing for Pittsburgh weather where we only have 6 to 8 inches of snow on the ground and 500,000 feet of cloud cover. And it's truly dark and dreary there right now. And so I'm very pleased to be here.
One more thing. We do have 2 ambassadors here today that I forgot to introduce. This is Louise Ross and Hayden Korn. Any questions that you have regarding the augmentative communication? Louise will be here half the day, so he has to head up to his city auditor's job. And Hayden will be here all day as well, so feel free to talk to them. PRC is paying for them to be here, so make them work.
Okay, well, I often start off by saying announcing that what I'm going to be talking about will be presenting ideas that are contrary to many of the ideas you currently have. But I don't know that that's the case in Phoenix. But I am going to be saying some things about vocabulary and language, and what word do children and adults really use, and how do they use them. And I believe that we use other than linguistic models for vocabulary selection. Although we think we're using linguistic and pragmatic models for vocabulary selection, I'm going to suggest that we really aren't. And to do that, I'm going to talk about what we know that children, what words children actually say, and what words adults actually say. And then we're going to look at the syntactic and other structures to see how they use them to make sense, and then in what situations they use them. And we'll start off here with vocabulary and language. And let's just see how it goes. Okay, vocabulary and language. What words do children and adults really use, and how do they use them? Core vocabulary makes up 3/4 of what adults and children actually say, and is often ignored in the design of AAC systems. 78% of the words we use daily are drawn from a core of fewer than 400 words. Now, that may be a bit surprising as a statistic, because it's tremendous good news. I remember the first time I encountered this, I was working at the Westinghouse Electric Corporation, and I was setting up an artificial intelligence system to note how the surface structure in a language situation to express an obligation, so they could do an automatic they could have an automatic program that would show them certain obligations in certain kinds of contracts that they had. And these contracts, or these operating procedures that were in essence contracts, were huge. They had a couple thousand pages apiece, and there'd be 5 or 6 volumes of these contracts for one, say, massive power plant. And I started going volume by volume, and I noticed that in each chapter, which was about 10 or 12 pages, that there were about 800 or 900 words that were used many times, and then 200 or 300 words that were used one time. And then I went to the next chapter, and I found the same thing. And I actually found that, you know, chapter after chapter, there was a core vocabulary that was being used, and it was the same from chapter to chapter to chapter. And I was quite amazed at this. This was back in the 70s. I was quite perplexed, but now we know a great deal more about that. 78% of the total words you say come from a core of fewer than 400 words. Why is that good news? Well, it can give us a very reasonable target for AAC vocabulary selection. Core vocabulary also is consistent across populations, activities, places, topics, and demographic groups. Now, this should run somewhat counter to the grain of most of what we think and most of our intuitions, but I'm going to spend an awful lot of today trying to demonstrate this to you. What I found was it didn't matter whether the chapter in the final safety analysis report for a power plant was talking about internal water piping, or whether it was talking about internally generated missiles, or it was talking about externally generated missiles. The base vocabulary from each of these chapters was always the same. It was only kind of a little cream on top that was different. And what you can find by actual data and by looking at scientific studies, which I'm going to be showing to you, you can show that the core vocabulary, the words we use all the time, are consistent across clinical populations. In other words, children use the same core words as adolescents, and children and adolescents use the same core words as adults. Adults use the same core words as people over 75, people who are called elderly. And they use these core words regardless of what activity they're involved in, where they're involved in whatever activity they're involved in, the topics of their conversation, and their demographics or their social groups. So if we were with a group of people in poverty in the Appalachians in a church study program, and they were talking about the book of Job, we would find that we did an analysis of 10,000 of the words that were said during a 2-day study period, that the core words there would be identical to the core words of a professional meeting in Los Angeles. And this is great good news, because I believe many of us have spent an awful lot of time finding those special words for each environment, haven't you? And spent an awful lot of time programming those in. And in fact, a dominating part of your interaction with students is through the medium of vocabulary selection and tuning the system for classes, for activities. Is this? Yeah. I'm going to question the validity of not all of that activity, but of a lot of that activity. And I'm also going to introduce a linguistic term called picture producer. Picture producer comes from the Schenck and Abelson language analysis, usually called conceptual dependency notation. I just gave you that as background because picture producer sounds like such a stupid little phrase, but it's in the midst of this highly technical approach for conceptual dependency notation. And Conceptual dependency notation is an effort to build a language description, a description of a phrase or a sentence that is language independent. And if you know the rules for putting it into the interlingua, and you know the rules for taking it out of the interlingua in two different languages, you can take an English sentence, put it into the interlingua, and have it come out as a Russian sentence on the other side. And have you seen where they're actually doing machine translation? Well, machine translation is in fact based on conceptual dependency notation, and words that produce pictures have certain characteristics that are translingual. And so one of the things you note about a word is whether it is a picture producer or not when you're building an interlingua. Okay, I hope that wasn't gilding a lily there, but that's the whole story on the term picture producer. And there we say in linguistics, words are divided into picture producers and non-picture producers. Which one of those two words is a picture producer? Toaster. Toaster is a picture producer, and job is not. Why isn't job a picture producer? Too wide, too abstract. Let's just try it in a practical way. How would you illustrate, how would you do a picture of job? Well, you could show someone raking leaves, or, do you rake leaves here? Someone, well, okay. I come from the leaf raking part of the world. And, okay, you could have a picture of someone digging in a garden, and that would be a job. Or someone washing dishes, that would be a job.
We do that.
What?
We do that here.
Do you wash dishes or dig in gardens, or both?
Wash dishes.
We wash dishes, okay. That's a job, but you'd still have the dishwashing activity itself. You'd have the dishes, you'd have the person who is doing it. And so you couldn't extract. In other words, that picture would not command the word job. It would command so many different words, you couldn't get job out of it. So a picture producer is a word that produces an actual picture. Many of these words are physical objects. Not all of them, but many of them are physical objects. Yet, which of those two words is actually used more frequently? Job. And strangely enough, which one of those words is used earlier? Job. I mean, you don't say, do a good toaster for daddy. We start using the word job quite early on, and yeah, so, we do. And so toaster and job. All right. Truck and trouble. Which one of these words might play a more significant role in the life of a 3.5-year-old boy? Trouble. Boys are going to be in trouble. And so truck is the picture producer and trouble is not. Yet, of these four words, we've already established that both of these words are more frequent, used earlier, and play bigger roles in the lives. Yet, which of these four words are we going to see on a communication board? You're going to see a toaster and a truck, and except when I do a seminar on picture producing, I don't say the word toaster very often. I saw the word toaster at my hotel this morning when I was eating breakfast. How many of you have not said the word toaster this morning? Okay. I have a former student here from the University of Pittsburgh. Wonderful to see you. And sometimes in my class at the University of Pittsburgh, I ask students to draw a picture of a non-picture producing word that's usually taken from the most common 200 words in English, and I cut some of them up on a piece of paper, and we put them in here, and we sort of shake them around, and then you draw a picture. And the pictures the students draw for those words, they show to a colleague, and then they show to the group. And no one has ever gotten a picture that anyone has been able to guess. And so that shows you, gives you a little bit of experience in how difficult it is to draw a word for a picture producer. One year, and I think it was a year you were there, one graduate, fourth semester, a master's level speech language pathology student came in, and her husband was an engineer, and she was obviously proud of that. And she said, my husband, an engineer, said, you're full of pancakes, and it was real easy to draw a picture for the word you gave me. And I said, okay, well, show me the picture. She told me what the word was. And the picture actually showed a military vehicle with cannon, with all these things going in and out and around it. And then it showed a car. And the car had an arrow going up and then dots like this. Can any of you guess what that picture was? Well, we showed it to everyone, and people said, don't you get it? Don't you get it? It's thank you. Yes, so even engineers can err. So it is very difficult to draw a picture of any. It's very difficult to draw a picture of mine. It's very difficult to draw a picture of some. And yet these are all words in the top 25 words used by toddlers. And we are led away from them because we have in our idea not a linguistic model, but an iconicity model or a picturability model. We want to put things that are concrete and easy to represent. And so and this is both scientifically justified, that it's easier for kids to learn and remember things that resemble what they're symbolizing. However, that whole way of looking at things tends to angle us away from language and its structures. Okay. A toaster can be unambiguously illustrated by a picture, but job cannot. A truck is easy to picture, trouble is not. The majority of words in a sentence are not picture producers. One word in the following sentence is a picture producer. Which one is it? Dinosaur. I went on a trip and saw a dinosaur. Now, dinosaur is the one word from there that we're likely to see on a communication board. And one reason is that we don't see the others is that they're so hard to picture. I mean, how do you picture went? And for instance, how does one, we think we can picture on. Because you could draw a square like that with a thing on it. But folks, that's not the majority of, that's not what on means for most of the time we use it. As in on a trip, or the guide talked on and on about picturability. Another example of this is the word up. I mean, it's on all the early vocabularies. It's a fairly early word, not as early as on, and we show it with an arrow going, up. And we're pretty sure that we've taught that word or that concept, and we're very happy with ourselves. But sometimes the concept is not exactly what happens to that word in language. Let me clear this up. I'll start off by saying the majority of times we use the word up. It has nothing to do with the direction of upness. And by the way, kids have a hard time understanding what an arrow pointing up means. There have been some studies about this. Kids have to be told and taught that. But what does up mean? You want to straighten up the room? I'm sure many of you put on very light makeup this morning, didn't you? Maybe not. If you've had a bad fight with a good friend, what's one of the things you want to do? You want to make up. And you know, you've been a naughty child and you told something that wasn't true, and your teacher said, you made up that story, didn't you? You know, I mean, you know, your students are pretty fragile. If you tell them to shut up, they're liable to shut down. You see, what I want to say here is that you see how widely we use up. Yes.
When you put your glasses down,
Uh-huh.
but actually you put them up so that you don't put them down and scratch the glass.
That's right. You put them up. Yes. I mean, not only are these terms oddly ambiguous because we deal with three-dimensional objects in the real world, but we use, the majority of times, up is used. Like shut up, you can still see shut and up. How many of you were taught in French the phrase fermez la bouche? By the way, that term is unknown to the French. That is a creation, a fabrication of American school teachers. If you say fermez la bouche to a French person, they will not know what you mean. The French expression is tais-toi, which can only be translated into English as accurately translated into English as silence you, or silent you. So when you say fermez la bouche in France, they are utterly clueless as to what that means. It's called a calque, in which American teachers tried to speak French, and they wanted to say shut up, and so they said fermez la bouche. And it's one of those. It's a wonderful kind of study, but at least with shut up, there's an idea of moving our jaw up. But for quite a few of the cases of up, in fact, for the majority of cases up, it has nothing to do with the directionality up. But don't we think we've taught the concept up when we've shown this arrow? Well, we have not. Language goes its own way and uses words for very different purposes. Okay. Fewer than 5% of words used in any activity by toddlers are picture producers. Concrete graphics can only be made for picture producers. More than 90% of core vocabulary words are not picture producers. We're going to look at populations here of toddlers, preschool children, adults, adolescents and young adults, people with cognitive impairments, older adults, and fluent augmented communicators. There are 7 populations here, and we're going to look at them. And let's go to the first one, is the vocabulary of toddlers. This is a study that was published in AAC in 2003, that's an error there, by Mayor Benaji, who is assistant professor of speech-language pathology at Louisiana State University. She is now with the New Orleans public school system. I don't believe she's still at Louisiana State. But this was a study she did somewhat in answer to my challenge. Quite a few years ago, Mayor heard me saying that the language of children, the real language of children, has very little to do with the language we put in communication aids. And so she wanted to do this, and she did it very formally. And 50 toddlers between the ages of 2 and 3, 34 girls, 16 boys. The fact that they're almost twice that there are twice as many girls as boys was mitigated by the fact that 4 of the young boys had parents who wouldn't sign the release forms. But I believe there was also another selection criterion, is that in 2- and 3-year-old children, sometimes boys don't have a lot to say. So, but they picked 34 girls who had a lot to say and 20 boys, and 4 of the boys couldn't participate. Okay, a variety of 2- and 3-word, 2 to 3 word utterances, spontaneously initiated interaction, maintained interaction by taking turns, terminated interaction appropriately, consistently followed simple 1-step directives and some 2-step directives. And here are the cute kids. These children were in nursery nursery schools or daycare programs within the metropolitan area of New Orleans, and in fact 3 of the settings were in the suburb called Metairie, if you're familiar with that area. It's a very large suburb just north of New Orleans. Okay, at least 1 free play and 1 snack time activity, instruction provided by a teacher or teacher's aide, organized by centers, classroom schedule provided small and large group activities. Some activities were led by an adult, others were child-directed. Here's the apparatus. There's a red sash here, and the red sash mounted the Radio Shack tape recorder. The microphone was mounted on the collar. The 4 little boys whose parents wouldn't sign the permission forms went ballistic on the day that they were doing on the days that they were doing these, and so they had to put sashes on them too. And I mean, they're so cute, and you could just see them, you know. And Tommy, you don't get a sash, and your red, you know, just wonderful. So there they are, and interactions between the children and the classroom staff were audio taped during 2 different activities on 3 separate days. 1 activity was child-directed, and an adult led the other activity. Each activity lasted approximately 20 minutes. The first 150 utterances within center time and snack time activities across all 3 days for each student were taken. The first 25 words were taken from each activity per student per day. 10 words were used across all activities and environments. Syntactic functions expressed included pronouns, verbs, and demonstratives. Pragmatic and semantic functions expressed included requesting action, negation, affirmation, and establishing joint attention. A lack of nouns was noted. Here is the toddler vocabulary, and you have it here for you. These 26 words comprised 96% of what the kids actually said. I mean, none of these words are surprising if you've been around children. I mean, there's I and my and mine. You know, that's there too, you know. But I think this is very interesting because I'm going to mount a hypothesis here that we tell each other and we write that we should use high motivation words. But chocolate cake is highly motivating to us and may be highly motivating to a child, but it's not a word a child actually uses. The very simple words are the words that children use. And if our motivation is to get the children to be speaking, I think we should provide them with developmentally appropriate vocabulary so they can learn to start making their 1- and 2-word utterances and then their 3-word utterances. And this vocabulary is relatively small. I think we shy away from this vocabulary because we have an iconicity or a picture-producing model in our minds. We want to make it concrete. Is concrete about the nicest thing you can say for a graphic? Oh, I would come up with, don't use that graphic. It's too concrete. I mean, that's not what we say, is it now? I mean, the more concrete it is, the better off for us. And when you're encoding vocabulary like this, our usual barometers for what makes up good vocabulary, our usual measures, well, if they're based on iconicity, may lead us in another direction from the vocabulary kids actually use. Look at the morphology. All done. Now, of course, that's not contrastive, but that's an irregular past participle. Mine, go, it is. By the way, it is almost always the first pronoun children use, not I. Get it? You know, it you know, fix it. They like it. Okay, there's the, and there's a, and in and on, and this is not a study of morphemes, but we can talk about that a little bit later. Okay. Okay, the vocabulary usage of adults and preschool children in 2 studies. The 2 studies I'm talking about are the Howells sampling at Harvard, which was for adults, and it was analyzed in AAC, in the Referee Journal, by Greg Vanderheiden and David Kelso, analyzed extensively in their 1988 article, and then it was quoted extensively in this 1989 article by David Buchelman. So we're actually discussing 3 articles. 2 of them appear dealing with adult language, and here it is with child language. But they're all from the same article, and they're all in the same place, and so I put them together. But we're going to be talking about adult language here. Is there anyone who would volunteer to read? I mean, it's easy.
The most frequently occurring words of a sample account for 40 to 50% of the total words communicated, while the 100 most frequently occurring words accounted for 60% of the total sample.
And this was from the Howells sampling done at Harvard. This was elicited speech. They showed people in veterans hospitals in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Long Island, 12 pictures. And they recorded their speech, and then they had graduate students type up these words. They did more than 250,000 words. And then they analyzed them, and they found that 50% of the total words, the 50 most frequently occurring words accounted for 40 to 50% of the total words, while the 100 most frequently occurring words accounted for 60% of the total sample. Wouldn't you like to know what those words are? When I did a project baptized by Caroline Musselwhite as Word Strategy, these many years ago, Howells was, the Howells list was our Bible. If it was in Howells, we wanted it. If it wasn't in Howells, we didn't care. That's how mix, pour, and stir got thrown out. Okay. Okay. In the present study of preschool children, now this is David Jones, Becky Jones, David Buchelman, and I don't know who Rowan is, but I know the other 2 guys. In the present study of preschool children, the 50 most frequently occurring words represent approximately 60% of the total sample, while the 100 most frequently occurring words accounted for 73% of the total sample. This was Becky's master's project, and this was her pilot study actually for her doctorate. And the top 250 words accounted for 85% of the total words. Sue Belandon at the University of Sydney has replicated this study with a graduate student named David Trembath, and she's come to the exact percentages that Becky Jones did. It's a remarkable replication, and they did it with preschool children, and I mean, it's remarkable dead bang. That study is also going to be in AAC. Okay, but the 250 word top accounted for 85% of the total words. Now we're going to take a look at another preschool study. This is Marvin, Buchelman, and Belia, and this is Christine Marvin's doctoral dissertation. And you have all of these words with you. And right now, Gail Van Tatenhove, Russell Cross, and I are working on a program for limited children. And we're trying to base our vocabulary not on Hal's, but we're deeply relating to the Naji and Marvin as vocabulary roots for us. Okay, let's take a look at the A's. Now, of course, the only picture producer here, I think, is ant. And that's a bit of a lesson for us. But take a look at other unexpected things. Well, one unexpected thing is, you know, these words represent about 80%, 85 or more percent of what the kids actually said. In the A's, there was only one picture producer. But look at the adverbs. Again, almost, already, also. Look at these adverbial preps, about, after. Look at, you know, an, ant, any, another, aren't, around, as, and at. These words are not words we typically see on language boards for preschool children, because we're not following a developmental language model. We're following a picture ability model. And we're also, I think how many of us have ever done an environmental inventory for building up a vocabulary? Well, I've done that. I remember Faith Carlson told us in this around in the late 70s or early 80s to crawl around the room and look up to see what the kids are seeing. And I came away with a notebook filled with these words or with nouns? Came away with a notebook filled with nouns. And I think we're drawn to nouns. They're the easiest to teach. They're the easiest to represent. They're the easiest to test for. They appear on the Peabody. Okay. So, but look at what words the children are actually saying. I think it's cautionary here. Here are the S words. Now, swing is going to be a picture producer, and I'm sure it referred to a noun. Susan Blockberger did a thing in the ASHA newsletter showing how sit was not a showing that sit was not a picture producer because you had someone going down toward a chair and it produced a lot of other things. But I'd like, sit is so close to a picture producer, it's kind of a picture producer wannabe. Sometimes it's called, you know, a high translucency verb, but others in here like show. I mean, there are two shows. I think there are two shows in sign language. There's one, we went to a show, and there's show me, and you can show up at a meeting. And if you're the wrong person, it can lead to a showdown. Particularly if the person's a show-off. Again, off having nothing to do with the meaning of off. Show down, having very little, you know, maybe metaphorical meaning with down, but to show up. I want to keep underscoring that we think we're teaching these words, and we're not teaching the words, because language is its own kind of internal system, and these things take structural roles that are very, very important and can't really be illustrated. Okay, look at this suite of indefinites here. Starting out with this basic quantifier, some, and then you have somebody, someone, something, sometime, somewhere. Dynasims has something for each one of these. Mayor Johnson, I don't believe, does. They may have a some. But in fact, we ignore these words because of their near impossibility to represent them concretely. But these words are, you know, what are you going to do? Where are you going? Nowhere. What'd you do? Nothing. You know, this is, these are the words of childhood, and little kids start using them, and I remember a little boy, my godson, he was sitting at this restaurant with his mom and me and his dad and his sister, and we were sitting there eating, and they served the hot pepper seeds. It was for spaghetti, and it was in the East Coast, and we had this bowl of hot pepper, and he was going like that, and he was playing with him, stop that, but he was being pretty mild, and then he started to cry, and he looked at his mom. What he'd been doing is then touching his face, and although his fingers showed no red, you know, he had gotten capsicum up into his eyes, and he turned to his mom and said, "Something's wrong!" And, you know, I mean, what, you know, so kids, this kid was 3 or 4, and something's wrong. He didn't know quite what to say or how to do it, but those words were what came. Okay, so look at, these are the words of childhood. And we tend not to put them on our communication aids for a couple of, you know, for a series of reasons. They're hard to assess, they're hard to teach, they're hard to illustrate, and they don't carry the kind of bang that saying a noun does to us psychologically. There have been all sorts of tests with parents. Chris Dollahan at the University of Pittsburgh has 200 hours of dyadic conversations between parents and 2- and 3-year-old children. And these were there was a control group and a scientific group or a study group, and what she was testing was phonological deficits in children who had had more than 2 eardrum punctures, because that meant that for a certain number of months the children had, you know, in their lives had, and she found, by the way, that there didn't seem to be significant phonological deficits, but it was a long study, was sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, and but the fruits of that, one of the fruits of that study were 200 hours of conversations between a kid and a parent, and the kids were between 2 and 3, and guess who said all the nouns? The kid or the parent? The parent said all the nouns. The parent said, "Cell phone," and the kid said, "Gimme." Mine, you know, the kid did not say cell phone. And in fact, as you look at this, and this was part of the Katya Hill's doctoral dissertation, she went through and did the nouns for this study, and the nouns, something like 96% of the nouns in that study were said by the parents. And in fact, the parents made very nouny conversations because, you know, and I believe that many of you are speech therapists in here, and in speech therapy, I know that this is can be a significant part of a person's practice. You get this 8 or 9-year-old boy referred to you because his teacher says he isn't talking right. And what you find is that he's not using any nouns. And so then you start peppering him with nouns, right? And then he comes around and starts using nouns, and then his whole language seems to free up. I'm sure many of you have had this experience personally and know the technique, and I've seen it done, you know, any number of times. And so another reason we like, as speech people, speech and language people, to use nouns is we've probably had the experience of helping someone free up their language by peppering them with nouns. But it's not, but these kids generally have okay language acquisition. They just don't have nouns. And so we can teach them to them, they're easy to teach, and we can test them on them, and it has a good effect. But I don't think that's the issue with AAC users. I don't think they need this noun peppering. They need something much earlier, namely the language acquisition phases. I mean, language acquisition is just so wonderful, and it's so unconscious. We'll talk more about that, about its unconsciousness. Well, let me just say, I can tell you something about your language that you know and have never made an error on, but you don't know in a conscious sense. It's not in the part of the brain you use to memorize the continents and the oceans. It's in another part of your brain. It's in the language part of your brain, and it's not available to your conscious cogitation. Did you know that any is never used as a direct object of a verb unless the verb is a question in a question format or has a negative modifier? Do you want any? Yes, I'd like any. You can say, I don't want any, and do you want any? You can also say, do you want some? Okay, so I bet you didn't know that, but you knew it immaculately. I mean, people speaking English never make that error. I mean, I don't even think post-stroke people make that error. So there's this huge knowledge package up there about language, and by the way, we don't assess that, I don't think, when we do our normal assessment tools, because our normal assessment tools are an effort to find out things that are more in the continents and oceans part of our brain, namely the nouns. When my mother was 91, shortly after coming here, her therapist, her physical therapist, said she needed to take a Peabody. And I think Mother's language was not doing well, or something was starting to happen, I think. Mother did the Peabody, and she got them all right, and the woman said to me privately, except beaver. I'm pretty sure that's what the word was, and walking down the hall, Mother was using her walker. Caroline and Froma know my mother, and she was not always a happy camper when subjected to something like this. And Mother was walking down the hall, and without any introduction, she looked at me and said, she didn't, didn't look like a beaver to me. Okay, so, but, we test on nouns because dementia starts coming in with it, the loss of some of these nouns, but what our kids are about is not nouns, it's learning that any can't be used as a direct object. And the only way you do that, you don't teach it, is you give the child any on his language board, so he or she can start mixing around with them, and hearing them and comparing them. And that's why I think sentences for early learners is very dangerous stuff. How many of you took foreign language in high school? Okay, most of us did. Now, being so close to another language community here, you may have had a more successful experience, but how many of you memorized dialogues? Conoces a Miguel? Sí, somos buenos amigos. We did that, right? How many of you generalized from those dialogues? No, I don't think we did. I know I made students get up there and they had this rehearsed skit and said, put a tie or an apron on a guy and said to another kid, was sitting there in a cafe, qu'est-ce que vous voulez, monsieur? Je voudrais prendre un Coca-Cola. These things did not take root in your mind, did they? And it's because you weren't assembling them. Those of you who did have a real language experience, and you went to the foreign country, the language started coming when you started making your own sentences, because that operates in a different part of the brain. It operates over in language acquisition, and it's another world altogether. And so what I'm afraid is we take someone, test him or her in a way that's more likely to reveal later learning abilities, and then we teach him or her stuff that uses later learning abilities, which we know for many of the people we're serving are not their strongest ability. But they have this huge biology up there that's been dealing with language for a long time, and I think that's why We need to aim at that. It's lower, but it's so much more important. And for us, it's somewhat out of our awareness because we don't know that we've got to use any in a bunch of different ways. And I didn't know a lot of stuff about English until I started teaching it in the French public high school. And man, I learned a lot there, a lot. And okay, my students thought that do didn't have any meaning, that you just put it in front of a sentence to make it become a question. I eat in the cafeteria, you eat in the cafeteria. Do you eat in the cafeteria? You just put it in front of a sentence, it makes it a question. They had no idea that it was in fact a verb form. Well, okay. All right. So you know, look at these words. Stuff. We say stuff all the time. We don't put it on a language board. Hard to represent, hard, you know, hard to teach, hard to assess. Okay, adolescent and young adult vocabulary usage. This is the Blandin sampling. It was published in AAC in 1999. It was actually done in '96. And these were conversational samples were collected from 34 non-disabled subjects across 4 work sites. The total sample was analyzed for core vocabulary and fringe vocabulary and the commonality of fringe vocabulary across topics. Other way, the definition that Blandin uses, anything that is in core vocabulary is fringe vocabulary. Okay. There was a small, stable core vocabulary of 347 words, which accounted for 78% of the conversational sample. And you have the Blandin corpus, there are many interesting Australianisms here. Look at the word bloody. See it, bloody, down there in the B's. Notice how vivid our Aussie brothers and sisters are. Look in the F words. Look in the S words. Sue Blandin was absolutely hysterical over the fact she's British and she believes Australians have something to learn, you know, and that the F word made it into a core vocabulary. And
It's in there about 18 more times. I'm sure we just don't recognize it because you can't say anything in Australia without having them crack up and you go, what? And they're just like, you did it again. Like, are you kidding? That means it too? So I think there are probably 18 more examples of the F word. We just don't know it.
Well, you see, if she would have only compiled them together, they could have been the 4th or 5th most common.
Yes, exactly. It's amazing. I'll look through and let you know if they're in
there. Up here, note that in the A's, note how similar they were to the previous A's. About, after, again, all right, always, and, another, any, around. Do you see how they're the same, kind of the same words? And these are some of the words that appeared in Donaji. Look over here in the S's. There's stuff. Look at the suite of sums. Some, someone, something. Even the she, she's, said, same. Guys, the overlap here is enormous. And we're going to see this on every assessment that we do in English. It doesn't matter whether it's British English or either in England or in Scotland or in Wales. It's the same everywhere. There is a core, and this core is under 400 words, and it accounts for an enormous percentage of the conversation. More interesting here, the number of words from the composite core vocabulary contained in each of the 5 most frequently referenced topics. That means, in fact, Valandon did a topic analysis, and in fact finding 347, all 100% of the core words were used. In work, 99% were used. In food, even in food, 261 of the 75% of the words from back here were used. So you see, these words are there with you all day long, from topic to topic. I mean, look at these, 91%, 99%. This is enormous. Okay, this next chart may have significant meaning. The total number of words and unique fringe vocabulary for each of the 5 most frequently occurring topics. In the work topic, only 5.6% of the words did not occur in other environments. Basically, it means close to saying that only 5.6% of the words were not core or multi-environment occurring. In fact, finding only 8% were outside. But the most interesting of the 13,000, so words used in food, only 286 were unique to the food category, 2%. Now, let's take an imaginary trip today. If we were going to Pizza Hut today, I picked Pizza Hut because it's a place I like to eat in, although I can't now because I've just come from a 10-day program and I've gotten off my diabetic meds. But I've got to continue eating like that. And Chicago-style pizza is not on that list. Okay, let's say we're going to a Pizza Hut, and let's say we were going to make up either a paper, a manual overlay for going to the Pizza Hut for a client, or we were going to do a page in an electronic system. What words would we want to have in there? Well, first we'd want to have a lot of the food items, wouldn't we? And then we'd want to have some of the command, please and thank you, as well as I want and can I. But let's see. I want, can I, napkin, maybe feed me or slow up feeding me, salads. What kind of toppings would we want? What? Dressing, salad dressing. You might want several of those. Let's name some toppings. Mushrooms, pepperoni, pineapple, sausage. Okay. I mean, we're getting them now. I mean, spinach. It wouldn't take us long to fill up a page with the various commands, the pleases and the thank yous and the salts and the how much and salad bar and the salad dressings and the toppings and Coca-Cola and small, medium, or Coca Pepsi, small, medium, or large. Hand tossed, personal pan, pan pizza. You can see the whole thing, and we'd go off to the, we could then go off to Pizza Hut. And as a clinician, we would have felt quite satisfied that we'd made a serious effort here, and our client would be armed with what he or she needed. But now let's say that we're going to a Pizza Hut, and we're going to have lunch with a friend, and we're actually going to be, after we get seated, we're going to be there 42 minutes before we leave. What amount of time in our conversation, which would probably be unceasing, would the vocabulary from the domains we just discussed be used? I mean, what percentage? The words you would use would come from core vocabulary. So what words would you really need at Pizza Hut for lunch. Core vocabulary. And there are under 400 of these, and we kind of ignore them in the building of our systems. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at here? By the way, if I were being real clever, I've tried this, now what vocabulary would we need if we were going to say Taco Bell? No, and then the answer is burrito. No, I know. The answer is core vocabulary. And so I think this is very interesting that only 2% of the words in the food topic were words unique to the food topic. So far, we've looked at toddlers, preschool children. Toddlers was the Banaji study, preschool children. We did 2, Buchelman, Jones, and Rowan, and Marvin, Buchelman, and Belia. We did adolescents, which was Banaji, which was adolescents and young adults, which was Landon, and we did adults, which was Howes. We have seen that more than 70% of the words used by these populations have come from a core of fewer than 350 words. We have also seen that 90% of these core words are not picture producers. Next, we are going to look at the vocabularies of special populations. Older adults, adolescents and adults with cognitive impairments, and fluent electronic augmented communicators. Okay. The vocabulary for these special populations shows the same pattern for core fringe ratios and for the absence of picture producers. Stewart, this is Sheila Stewart. She's at the National Children's Hospital or National Rehabilitation Hospital in DC. Stewart identified the vocabulary use patterns of 65 to 74-year-old and 75 to 85-year-old adults. Communication samples of routine conversations were collected from 2 cohorts of 10 individuals each, 5 men and 5 women, using voice-activated portable audio tape recorders. These were, where did Sheila Stewart find these? Well, she found them in a Methodist church in Lincoln, Nebraska. They were, older people, and they volunteered, and they put the tape recorder, the same kind of procedure. Okay. The frequency of word use patterns across the age cohorts is quite similar. The 25 most commonly occurring words was 37% for the 65 to 74-year-old cohort, 39% for the 75 to 80-year-old cohort. The percentage of the total sample represented by the 250 most common words was 78% for the 65 to 74-year-old cohort and 78% for the 75 to 85-year-old cohort. The actual single words used by the cohort showed a large degree of overlap. Although the topics of the cohorts were sometimes quite different, the overlap among the cohorts was over 90%. The differences in topics, where the greatest was the 65 to 75-year-old women, 74-year-old women, as opposed to the 75 to 85-year-old men. The men were talking about stories from their lives, largely. And the 65 to 74-year-old women were still involved with the rearing of their grandchildren. And a couple of the men had actually been in the Pacific during the Second World War. And okay, so you're changing a diaper, or you're wading ashore at Guadalcanal, wet, smelly, the odor, tired, dangerous, okay, what I'm saying is you can just, oh man, you should have been there. You should have been there. It was awful. They left them with me. You know, nobody was there but me. You know, I mean, it's, you know, one person is talking about being stuck with babysitting and having her daughter and son-in-law not come home until way late. And the other guy's talking about what it was like to be crouched down at Guadalcanal. But the words are the same. Just like I found at Westinghouse. It didn't matter whether we were talking about, you know, the water flowing for bathrooms, for, you know, inside the